My sister sent me a single text message that read, "Do not come to the wedding." I did not scream. I did not beg. I quietly booked a one-way flight to Monaco. 5 days later, her dream wedding fell apart. My phone started buzzing with 60 missed calls. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old, and I am the CEO of the most ruthless crisis management and private investigation firm in Atlanta. If a politician gets caught in a scandal, they call me. If a corporate executive needs a digital footprint erased before a board meeting, my firm handles it. I operate in the shadows, cleaning up messes for the ultra-wealthy. Because of the discreet nature of my business, my family has always viewed my career as gritty, unsavory, and entirely lacking in the refined elegance they so desperately crave. My parents, Vivian and Calvin, own a mid-tier chain of car dealerships. They have spent their entire lives clawing their way into the upper echelons of African American high society in Atlanta. They care about country club memberships, front row seats at the mega church, and the superficial markers of success. My younger sister Chloe, who is 27, is their absolute golden child. She is a social media influencer whose entire existence revolves around aesthetics designer labels and projecting an image of flawless luxury. The nightmare began on a humid Tuesday afternoon inside an exclusive Vera Wang bridal boutique in Buckhead. The air smelled of expensive vanilla candles and fresh orchids. Chloe stood on a circular pedestal, admiring her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She was wearing a custom ivory gown covered in hand-stitched French lace. She looked beautiful, and she knew it. I was sitting on a plush velvet sofa just 2 feet away, holding my black American Express card. The sales associate, a woman with a polite but tight smile, handed me the final receipt. The remaining balance for the gown was $15,000. I signed my name without hesitation, just as I always did when my family needed someone to foot the bill for their extravagant lifestyle. As the receipt printed, my phone vibrated in my designer handbag. I pulled it out and saw a new message from Chloe. I looked up. Chloe was still standing on the pedestal, holding a glass of complimentary champagne, tapping away on her phone with a perfectly manicured thumb. She did not even look in my direction. I opened the message. The text read, "Do not come to the wedding. Julian and his mother Beatrice think your gritty public relations background and independent lifestyle will embarrass his family in front of the Atlanta elite. Mom agrees you do not fit the social standard of the gala. I will text you pictures." I stared at the glowing screen. Julian was Chloe's fiancé. He was 33 years old and supposedly a highly successful venture capitalist. He came from a family that prided itself on legacy. He was a proud member of Kappa Alpha Psi, and his mother Beatrice was a prominent figure in every exclusive social circle in the city. Beatrice was a woman who believed she was royalty simply because her grandfather had owned a successful funeral home in the 1950s. She looked down on anyone who actually had to work for their wealth, especially women like me who dealt with corporate scandals and unglamorous truths. I looked at my sister. She was smiling at her reflection, admiring the $15,000 dress I had just paid for. She had sent the text while I was actively signing the receipt. The audacity was breathtaking. I did not confront her in the boutique. My profession had taught me that reacting emotionally only gives your opponent power. I quietly placed my phone back in my bag, thanked the sales associate, and walked out into the warm Atlanta afternoon. The real confrontation happened 5 days later during our traditional Sunday dinner. In my family, Sunday dinner after church was not just a meal, it was a theatrical performance. My parents lived in a sprawling estate in South Fulton, a massive brick house with a manicured lawn and a dramatic circular driveway. The dining room featured a long mahogany table set with fine china and crystal glasses. The air was rich with the smell of baked macaroni and cheese-collared greens, fried chicken, and my mother's famous peach cobbler. On this particular Sunday, the table was packed. Several prominent pastors from their megachurch were present, along with a few high-profile business associates my parents were trying to impress. Julian sat next to Chloe wearing a tailored suit, looking every bit the polished legacy son my mother adored. I sat quietly at my designated spot, eating my meal, listening to the performative chatter about golf tournaments and charity galas. When my mother brought out the dessert plates, she stopped near my chair. She was wearing her signature pearls and a fixed, condescending smile. She casually dropped a brown envelope onto the table next to my plate. The envelope contained the final invoice from the luxury florist for the wedding. Before I could even open it, I reached into my pocket and placed my phone flat on the mahogany table. I slid it directly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of my mother's plate. The screen was brightly lit, displaying the exact text message Chloe had sent me in the bridal boutique. The conversation around the table slowly died down. The pastors looked confused. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Chloe refused to make eye contact with me, suddenly very interested in her napkin. My mother picked up the phone. She read the message. Her expression did not change. There was no gasp of horror, no maternal outrage at her youngest daughter's cruelty. Instead, she slowly set the phone down and looked at me with eyes as cold as ice. She validated the text message right there in front of the entire dinner party. She did not even try to whisper. Her voice was clear and precise, ensuring every guest at the table heard her justification. "You need to sacrifice for your sister Naomi," my mother said, her tone dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Julian is a Kappa. His family represents generations of legacy. Chloe needs the respect of her new in-laws. You showing up unescorted, smelling like corporate warfare and scandal, will just make things awkward for everyone. We have to maintain a certain standard." I looked around the table. The pastors averted their eyes, feigning interest in their peach cobbler. Julian smirked, a tiny, arrogant lifting of his upper lip. He enjoyed seeing me put in my place. He enjoyed the power his family name held over my parents. My father Calvin kept his head down, taking a slow sip of his sweet tea, completely refusing to intervene. He had always enabled my mother's social climbing, preferring peace over defending his eldest daughter. My mother was not finished. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the brown envelope she had placed next to my plate. By the way, she continued, completely unfazed by the toxic environment she was nurturing. "Make sure you clear that $40,000 floral invoice by Tuesday morning. The hotel needs it paid in full before they begin the ballroom installation. Consider it your sisterly duty to ensure her day is perfect even if you are not there to witness it." I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not flip the table or give them the angry reaction they were waiting for. I slowly wiped the corners of my mouth with my linen napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. The absolute quiet in the room was deafening. Every eye was locked on me, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. They wanted me to beg. They wanted me to cry and ask why I was not good enough to attend my own sister's wedding. I denied them that satisfaction. I stood up from my heavy wooden dining chair. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor echoed loudly through the tense room. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored dress. I walked around the large mahogany table, my heels clicking methodically with each step. I bypassed my mother entirely. I stopped behind my father's chair. I leaned down, wrapped my arms around his shoulders, and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Enjoy the cobbler, Dad," I whispered softly. I straightened my posture, picked up my phone from the table, and walked out of the dining room. I did not look back at Chloe. I did not look back at Julian. I walked down the long carpeted hallway of the estate, glancing briefly at the expensive family portraits lining the walls. In every single picture, I was positioned slightly in the background, out of focus, while Chloe and my parents stood front and center, bathed in perfect lighting. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the cool evening air. My driver, David, was waiting by the curb in my black SUV. He immediately noticed the shift in my demeanor and opened the rear door without a word. I climbed inside, the heavy door shutting with a solid thud, closing off the sounds of my family's estate. The interior of the car was quiet, smelling of rich leather and subtle cologne. I sank into the back seat and let out a long, slow breath. I opened my laptop and pulled up my secure banking portal. For years, I had been the silent financial pillar of my family. Because my parents poured all their dealership profits into maintaining their lavish image, they frequently fell short on actual cash flow. I was the one who quietly covered the gaps. I was the one who paid for Chloe's expensive college apartment. I was the one who funded the extravagant vacations they posted online. It was time to sever the lifeline. I navigated to the credit card management dashboard. My fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. First, I selected the platinum card I had given Chloe for wedding incidentals. I clicked the red button marked Disable Card. The screen flashed a confirmation message. Next, I pulled up the scheduled wire transfers. The $40,000 payment to the luxury florist in Buckhead was pending for Monday morning. I hit Cancel Transfer. I did not stop there. I found the recurring monthly transfer that covered the lease on Chloe's luxury sports car. Cancelled. I found the secondary card my mother used for her weekly country club lunches. Disabled. With every click of my mouse, I felt a heavy chain snapping off my chest. I was systematically dismantling the financial infrastructure that allowed them to treat me like a disposable asset. I was cutting off their oxygen supply, and they had absolutely no idea it was happening. The sense of relief that washed over me was intoxicating. I closed my laptop and looked out the tinted window of the SUV. The streetlights of Atlanta blurred past as we drove. I could have gone back to my penthouse condo in Midtown to spend the week working, but the thought of remaining in the same city as their grotesque celebration felt suffocating. I needed absolute distance. Absolute. David, I said, breaking the silence in the car. Please change our destination. Do not take me home. Take me to Peachtree DeKalb Airport. David glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his professional demeanor unwavering. Right away, Ms. Naomi. Which terminal? The private charter terminal, please. I picked up my phone and called my travel concierge. The service was exclusively for high net worth individuals capable of arranging miracles with a single phone call. I requested a private jet to Europe, specifically Monaco, departing as soon as clearance could be granted. I wanted to be surrounded by the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. I wanted to drink fine wine on a yacht and feel the sun on my skin, while my family realized exactly whose money had been keeping them afloat. By midnight, I was sitting in the plush leather seat of a Gulfstream jet soaring high above the Atlantic Ocean. The cabin was silent, save for the gentle hum of the engines. I looked out the small oval window into the pitch-black sky. I thought about Chloe, probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of her perfect wedding, completely unaware that her credit cards were now useless pieces of plastic. I thought about my mother, secure in her belief that she had successfully managed the family optics, unaware that the florist would be calling her on Tuesday morning, demanding $40,000 in cash. I landed in the south of France the next morning and took a helicopter directly to Monaco. The air was crisp, tasting of sea salt and money. The harbor was packed with massive super yachts gleaming in the bright sunlight. I boarded my chartered yacht, greeted by a discreet crew who handed me a glass of chilled champagne. For the next 4 days, I completely disconnected from the reality of Atlanta. I turned off my personal cell phone and only used a secure line to communicate with my office. I spent my mornings swimming in the warm waters, my afternoons reading on the sun deck, and my evenings eating fresh seafood at exclusive restaurants perched on the cliffs. It was a kind of peace I had not experienced in over a decade. I was entirely untethered from the toxic expectations of my family. But my peace was merely the quiet before the storm. In my line of work, I knew that actions always have consequences. I knew that the moment a financial lifeline is cut, the dependents begin to suffocate. I knew that a wedding funded by a phantom wallet could not survive contact with reality. I spent my 5th morning in Monaco, sitting on the aft deck of the yacht, wearing a silk robe and enjoying a perfect shot of espresso. The Mediterranean sun was warming my face. I decided it was time to check my personal phone. I had kept it powered down in a drawer in my stateroom since the flight. I walked downstairs, retrieved the device, and held down the power button. The glowing Apple logo appeared. I walked back up to the deck, set the phone on the glass table next to my coffee cup, and waited. The moment the phone connected to the international cellular network, it exploded with activity. The device vibrated violently against the glass table, emitting a constant, aggressive buzzing sound. Notifications flooded the lock screen in a relentless stream. There were 5 voicemails from my mother, 10 frantic text messages from my father, 30 completely unhinged messages from Chloe. And then the missed call notifications began to aggregate. 10 missed calls, 20 missed calls, 40 missed calls. I watched the counter climb until it finally stopped at exactly 60 missed calls. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, letting the rich, bitter taste linger on my tongue. I watched a seagull dive toward the sparkling blue water in the distance. The absolute panic radiating from my phone was palpable, a digital manifestation of a family realizing that the very foundation they stood upon had completely vanished. They had told me not to come to the wedding. They had told me I did not fit their standard. They had cast me out with cruel precision. But they had forgotten the golden rule of survival in the elite circles they so desperately wanted to inhabit. You never bite the hand that feeds you, especially when that hand holds all the power. I set my coffee cup down. I picked up the phone. I knew the wedding was falling apart. I knew the florist had likely halted the delivery. I knew the caterers were probably threatening to walk out. But as I began to listen to the voicemails, I realized that the financial cutoff was only the beginning of their nightmare. A much darker, much more devastating truth was hiding beneath the surface of Julian's perfect legacy, and my team of investigators had just uncovered the ultimate weapon. I stared at the screen of my phone, my thumb hovering over the play button for the first voicemail. The Mediterranean breeze ruffled the edges of my silk robe. The 60 missed calls were a testament to the chaos I had unleashed by cutting off their credit cards. But before I could listen to my mother panic over floral arrangements, a high-priority notification overrode the screen. It was not a text. It was not a call from an angry relative. It was a red banner alert from Vanguard Private Wealth Management. It required biometric authentication to even open. I pressed my thumb to the sensor. The application unlocked, displaying a direct, urgent message from Marcus, my lead wealth manager. It read, "Urgent fraud protocol triggered. Please call immediately regarding the Cascade Heights property." The satisfaction I felt just moments ago evaporated, replaced by the icy, razor-sharp focus that had made me the top crisis manager in Atlanta. I ignored the 60 missed calls from my family. I dialed Marcus on my secure encrypted line. He answered before the first ring completed. Naomi, Marcus said, his usually calm voice tight with poorly concealed stress. "Thank God you called. We have a massive problem. I need you to confirm your location for me right now." "Are you in Atlanta?" "I am in Monaco," I replied, my voice steady, my eyes fixed on the horizon where a massive super yacht was slowly cutting through the turquoise water. "I have been out of the country for 5 days. What is happening with the Cascade Heights property?" There was a heavy pause on the line. I could hear the sound of a keyboard clacking furiously in the background. Cascade Heights was not just a piece of real estate, it was Big Mama's house. My great-grandmother had purchased the sprawling historic estate back in the 1970s when redlining was still a suffocating reality for Black families in Georgia. It was a symbol of generational endurance. When she passed away, she bypassed my mother entirely and left the estate exclusively to me, free and clear. My parents, desperate to maintain their facade of generational wealth, had begged to live there. I allowed it, paying the property taxes myself, simply to keep the peace. It was a decision I was about to severely regret. Marcus let out a breath. Naomi, a $500,000 mortgage loan was just finalized against the Cascade Heights estate. The funds were cleared and dispersed 48 hours ago. They were routed directly into a joint checking account at a completely different institution. The account is registered to Chloe and a man named Julian. The words hung in the warm Monaco air. $500,000. $500,000 borrowed against my family's most sacred asset, funneled directly into the pockets of the golden child and her perfect legacy fiancé. I did not scream. I did not drop my espresso cup. My mind immediately shifted into forensic mode, dissecting the crime with terrifying precision. How was this authorized, Marcus? The estate is solely in my name. I hold the deed. I have a freeze on all major credit inquiries. How does a $500,000 loan get underwritten without my physical presence or verbal confirmation? That is why the fraud team flagged it, but only after the disbursement. Marcus explained, the frustration evident in his tone. The loan was originated through a boutique, aggressively unregulated lending firm in Buckhead, not through Vanguard. They bypassed standard digital verification by requesting a physical mail verification protocol. The lending firm sent physical documents containing a unique authorization PIN directly to the property address on file, the Cascade Heights estate. Someone at that address received the mail, extracted the PIN, and used it to digitally validate the loan. Furthermore, they submitted physical copies of the mortgage agreement. The signatures on the deed collateralization match yours flawlessly, and they were notarized. My eyes narrowed. The bright Mediterranean sun suddenly felt glaring harsh. Notarized by whom? Marcus typed for a second. The notary stamp belongs to a Vivian and Calvin Enterprises, your parents' car dealership. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, yet my exterior remained perfectly coldly still. This was never about my gritty public relations background. It was never about Julian's elite Kappa Alpha Psi legacy or his mother Beatrice feeling embarrassed by my corporate warfare lifestyle. It was never about me not fitting the social standard of a high society Atlanta wedding. It was a calculated, premeditated heist. I closed my eyes, letting the timeline replay in my head. The text message from Chloe in the Vera Wang boutique. The orchestrated public humiliation at the Sunday dinner table. My mother demanding I pay a $40,000 floral invoice she knew I would refuse. They wanted to start a fight. They needed a spectacular bridge-burning conflict. They needed me so furious, so insulted, and so thoroughly excommunicated that I would leave Atlanta entirely. They knew exactly how I operated. They knew my pride would not allow me to stay in the city and watch them celebrate my exclusion. They knew I would book a flight and disappear across the ocean. They needed me completely out of the time zone, unreachable, and distracted by the sting of their rejection. Because if I was in Monaco, I was nowhere near the mailbox at the Cascade Heights estate. I was nowhere near the physical verification letters the boutique lending firm was sending. My own parents had manufactured my exile so they could forge my signature, stamp it with their own illegitimate notary seal, and rob me of $500,000 to fund Chloe's fraudulent happily ever after. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of humanity. The notary stamp is fraudulent. I did not sign those papers. I have been in Europe for 5 days. My passport stamps and flight manifests will prove my location during the exact window the final verification was submitted. I understand, Naomi, but the funds have already settled in Chloe and Julian's joint account. Vanguard is initiating a clawback protocol with the receiving bank, but because the loan originated outside our institution, the process is going to be incredibly messy. This is federal wire fraud. We need to involve the authorities immediately. Hold the police, I commanded sharply. Do not file the police report yet. Do not alert the boutique lending firm that we know. Marcus hesitated. Naomi, standard protocol dictates we alert the authorities the moment we confirm identity theft of this magnitude. If they move that money offshore or drain the account, they are not moving it offshore. I interrupted, my mind racing 10 steps ahead of the bankers. They are paying for a wedding. Julian and Chloe think they just secured the ultimate payday. They think I am currently sitting on this yacht crying over their 60 missed calls because I disabled their luxury car leases and country club cards. They think they outsmarted me. I want them to continue believing that for exactly 5 more days. I stared down at my phone. The screen was still lit up with the notifications of their panic. The hotel caterers must be threatening to walk out. The florists must be demanding cash. My parents and Chloe were likely trying to access the stolen $500,000 right this very second to cover the gaps I had created by canceling their primary credit cards. Freeze the Vanguard accounts so no further damage can be done, I instructed Marcus. But leave the loan dispute in a pending internal status for now. I am assembling my own crisis investigation team in Atlanta. I want every single digital footprint, every wire transfer log, and every piece of forged paper securely downloaded and sent to my encrypted server by midnight. Understood, Marcus replied, his professional demeanor returning. But Naomi, you are playing a dangerous game. This is not a corporate rival you are dealing with. This is your family. They just committed a felony against you. I know exactly what they did, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. And in my industry, Marcus, we do not just stop a scandal, we weaponize it. I will handle the authorities on my own timeline. I ended the call. The silence on the deck of the yacht was absolute. The gentle lapping of the water against the hull felt like a metronome ticking down the hours until the wedding. I picked up my phone again. The counter now read 72 missed calls. My mother had left another voicemail. I pressed play, listening through the phone's speaker. Naomi? My mother's voice echoed across the quiet deck, shrill and dripping with manufactured panic. Naomi answered the phone. The platinum card declined at the hotel. The concierge is threatening to cancel the ballroom reservation. Stop throwing a childish tantrum over a simple family disagreement and turn the cards back on. We are trying to celebrate your sister. You are ruining everything. Call me back immediately. The sheer audacity of the voicemail was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. She was lecturing me about a childish tantrum while simultaneously stealing $500,000 from my inheritance using forged federal documents. She was standing in the very house I owned, plotting my financial ruin and demanding I pay the catering bill. I deleted the voicemail. I did not feel heartbreak. The capacity to feel betrayal requires a baseline of trust, and my parents had just obliterated whatever microscopic fraction of trust I had left for them. I felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over me, the kind of calm that precedes absolute destruction. I opened my encrypted messaging application and created a new group chat. I added the 3 most ruthless operatives in my crisis management firm: Vance, my lead cybersecurity expert; Sarah, my forensic accountant; and David, my head of private investigations. These were the people I deployed when a Fortune 500 CEO needed a rival decimated without leaving fingerprints. Today I was deploying them against my own blood. I typed a single message into the secure chat. Operation Legacy is active. Target Julian and Chloe. I need a complete financial autopsy on Julian. I want to know where every cent of his supposed venture capital wealth comes from. I want his bank records, his offshore accounts, and his communication logs. I also need the security camera footage from my parents' car dealership for the past 14 days, specifically focusing on the notary desk. Find the forged mortgage documents. I want everything verified, undeniable, and ready for federal prosecution by Friday night. Vance replied less than 30 seconds later. Consider it done, boss. We are on it. I locked my phone and set it face down on the glass table. I picked up my espresso cup. The coffee was cold, but I drank it anyway. The bitter taste matched the metallic resolve settling in my chest. My parents thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They thought my distance was their shield. They thought because I was the family outcast, the gritty, unsavory daughter who handled other people's scandals, that I would be an easy mark. They had severely miscalculated. They had brought a polite socialite scheme to a corporate warfare battlefield. I leaned back in the plush chair, looking out at the super yachts dotting the Monaco harbor. 5 days. In 5 days, Chloe would put on her $15,000 custom Vera Wang gown. Julian would put on his tailored tuxedo. My parents would stand in front of the Atlanta elite wearing their stolen pride and their forged wealth. And exactly when they thought they had won, I would burn their entire world to the ground. By Tuesday morning, the Mediterranean sun was glaring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the yacht's master stateroom. I sat at the glass desk with a fresh espresso in hand, staring at my encrypted video conference screen. My team had been working tirelessly through the night. In my line of work, speed is just as lethal as accuracy, and my operatives were the absolute best in the business. Vance, my lead cybersecurity expert, patched into the secure feed first. He had bypassed the boutique lending firm's firewall with embarrassing ease. He pulled up the digitized mortgage documents on the shared screen, zooming in on the final page. Seeing my own signature forged on the contract sent a fresh spike of ice through my veins. It was a decent forgery, clearly practiced mimicking the sharp, aggressive angles of my handwriting. But the real damning evidence was not the signature itself. It was the blue ink right below it. David, my head of private investigations, unmuted his microphone. He highlighted the official notary stamp validating the fraudulent signatures. The stamp read, Vivian and Calvin Enterprises. My parents had actually used the official notary stamp from their own car dealership to authorize the theft of my estate. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. They assumed because I was their daughter, I would never audit the paperwork. They thought their parental authority shielded them from federal law. David had already pulled the security camera footage from the dealership's back office. The video played on my screen. It clearly showed my mother and father standing over the documents on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. My mother was pointing at the signature line and my father was laughing as he firmly pressed the notary stamp onto the paper. They were giggling while committing a federal felony against their eldest child, Sarah. My forensic accountant joined the call. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She immediately shared her screen, bringing up a complex, multi-layered web of financial wire transfers. The $500,000 landed in Chloe and Julian's joint account at exactly 9 in the morning. On Monday, Sarah explained, her voice clinical and precise. But it did not stay there. Within 2 hours of the deposit, the funds were splintered into 4 different outgoing wires. Not a single cent went to the luxury hotel in Buckhead. Not a single cent went to the florist, the caterer, or the wedding planner. I leaned closer to the monitor. Follow the money, Sarah. Where did it go? Sarah traced the digital footprints. The funds were used to pay off massive, aggressively delinquent debts. This was the exact moment the glittering, perfectly curated facade of Julian's life shattered completely. The flawless venture capitalist, the Kappa Alpha Psi legacy son, the man whose mother looked down on my gritty career, was entirely hopelessly broke. Sarah revealed that Julian's supposed venture capital firm was nothing more than a registered LLC with 0 assets and 0 successful portfolios. His luxury loft in Midtown Atlanta was rented, and he was 4 months behind on the lease. The property management company had already drafted eviction papers. His custom-tailored suits, the ones he wore to Sunday dinner at my parents' estate, were bought on high-limit credit cards that were currently in severe default. Even his luxury sports car was leased under his mother's name, and that lease was facing imminent repossession by the bank. David chimed in with the background check on Beatrice, Julian's incredibly arrogant mother. Beatrice loved to boast about her family's legacy wealth, constantly referencing her grandfather's historic funeral home empire. The truth was entirely different. The funeral home had gone bankrupt in the late 1980s due to severe mismanagement and tax evasion. Beatrice had been living on the fumes of a dead reputation for over 30 years. She survived through aggressive social climbing, leveraging her church connections, and maxing out personal loans. Julian was not a prince of Atlanta high society. He was a generational grifter. I looked at the wire transfer logs again. Sarah broke down the exact disbursements of my money. $200,000 went to an offshore account in the Caymans tied to a private equity firm that operates more like a high-end loan shark, Sarah replied. Julian borrowed heavily from them a year ago to maintain his wealthy aesthetic. They were threatening to seize his mother's remaining assets and expose him publicly. And the rest, I asked, my voice dangerously flat. $50,000 went to a luxury car dealership to stop the repossession order on his vehicle. Another $100,000 covered back taxes and severe penalties for his fake LLC. The remaining $150,000 was transferred directly into Beatrice's personal checking account to cover her own mountain of socialite debt. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. They used my inheritance, the property my great-grandmother worked her entire life to secure, to fund Beatrice's country club lifestyle. The same woman who called my career blue collar was currently paying off her Neiman Marcus credit card with my stolen money. But the most disturbing part of the investigation was uncovering the true motive behind my parents' involvement. My parents were not naive victims of Julian's scam. They were willing accomplices. Sarah pulled up a series of intercepted emails from my father's private server. A month ago, the luxury hotel hosting the wedding had threatened to cancel the entire reservation because Julian's initial deposit checks had bounced. My father confronted Julian in private. Cornered and desperate, Julian confessed that he was liquidating assets and needed a temporary bridge loan. But my father was a seasoned businessman. He ran a quiet, unauthorized credit check on his future son-in-law and found the massive crater of debt. Vivian and Calvin knew Julian was a complete fraud. They knew Chloe was marrying a man who could not even afford the floral arrangements for the altar. But my parents were too far gone in their own vanity. They had already bragged to their megachurch congregation about their billionaire son-in-law. They had already invited the absolute highest tier of the Atlanta elite to the wedding. Canceling the gala and admitting their golden child was marrying a broke con artist would destroy the social standing they had spent decades meticulously building. The public embarrassment would be fatal to their massive egos. So instead of protecting their daughter from a financial predator, they decided to protect their image. They decided to bail Julian out. But they could not use their car dealership's operating funds without triggering a corporate audit. And they did not have $500,000 in liquid cash sitting around to cover Julian's massive debts and pay for the lavish wedding simultaneously. That was when they looked at me. They looked at Big Mama's historic estate. They looked at the wealth I had built through sheer grit and relentless corporate warfare. To them, I was not a daughter. I was a convenient, disposable slush fund. They forged the mortgage documents to steal my money. They handed that money directly to a man they knew was a fraud just to keep him afloat until the wedding was over. And then they deliberately orchestrated a vicious public family fight at Sunday dinner to ban me from the wedding. They needed me angry enough to leave the country so I would not be around to uncover the theft while the loan was processing. The depravity of their logic was chilling. They chose optics over their own flesh and blood. They literally mortgaged my future to pay off Julian's loan sharks, all so they could take pretty pictures in a ballroom and pretend they belonged to a class of people who would never truly accept them. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the full weight of their betrayal. The sea breeze drifting through the yacht's cabin suddenly felt entirely cold. I had spent my entire adult life bailing them out of their petty financial mistakes, covering their gaps, and acting as the silent pillar of the family. I had tolerated their insults and their blatant favoritism toward Chloe because I believed underneath the toxic behavior we were still family. I was wrong. I was nothing but collateral to them. Excellent work, I told my team, my tone shifting into absolute authority. Download every single file. Secure the dealership security footage. Package the financial traces into a single undeniable dossier. I want it formatted and ready for federal review. Vance nodded on the screen. You got it, boss. What is our next move? We hold our position, I replied. Julian and Beatrice think their debts are cleared. My parents think their secret is safe. Let them enjoy their delusion for a few more days. Keep monitoring their accounts. Alert me if they attempt to move any more capital. I ended the video conference and closed my laptop. The investigation had given me everything I needed. I had the motive, I had the method, and I had the indisputable proof of their crime. They had handed me the exact weapons required to destroy them. I picked up my personal phone again. The missed call counter was still climbing, a digital testament to the panic setting back in Atlanta. The wedding was only 4 days away, and without the credit cards I had disabled, the event was already bleeding out. But the financial squeeze was just the opening act. I was going to let them sweat. I was going to let them panic over catering bills and floral invoices while the true hammer hung silently over their heads. My parents wanted to play a high-stakes game of social survival. They wanted to protect a fraud to save their own vanity. I was going to ensure that their precious legacy was torn apart in front of the very people they sacrificed me to impress. The elite circles of Atlanta were about to witness a masterclass in crisis execution, and I would be pulling the strings from 5,000 miles away. The Mediterranean sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a brilliant golden hue across the water. I remained in my plush lounge chair on the aft deck, watching the missed call counter on my phone tick upward. 75, 80, 82. My parents and my sister were in a state of absolute unmitigated panic. I had fully intended to leave the device untouched for the rest of the evening to let them marinate in the financial drought I had just created. But then the screen lit up with an incoming call from a number I did not recognize. It was an Atlanta area code, but it was not Calvin, Vivian, or Chloe. In my line of work, an unknown number during a crisis is an unforced error waiting to be exploited. I picked up the phone. I tapped the green button and brought the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply listened, waiting for the caller to declare their position on the battlefield. Well, I must say, tracking down this international number was quite the chore. The voice was unmistakable. It carried that distinct, syrupy southern drawl that dripped with artificial sweetness and weaponized etiquette. It was Beatrice, Julian's mother. I sat up slightly, my grip tightening on the phone. Beatrice was a woman who practically suffocated everyone around her with her exaggerated sense of self-importance. She was the kind of woman who wore pearls to the grocery store and spoke in hushed, condescending tones about anyone who lived outside of her designated zip code. The fact that she was calling me in Monaco just days before the wedding meant she was completely unaware of the financial apocalypse unfolding in her son's bank accounts. She was calling for sport. She was calling to mark her territory. "Hello, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly level. I kept my tone entirely devoid of emotion. "I'm surprised you have the time to call. I assumed you would be busy managing the final details of the gala." "Oh, the gala is running flawlessly," Beatrice replied, letting out a soft, breathy laugh. "Julian and Chloe are handling the minor vendor hiccups. I am currently sitting in the bridal suite at the St. Regis, enjoying a lovely glass of Laurent Perrier. I simply felt it was my Christian duty to reach out to you, Naomi. I know how difficult this week must be for someone in your unfortunate position." She was lying, of course. There were no minor vendor hiccups. Chloe's credit cards were bouncing all over Buckhead, and the hotel was likely threatening to lock the ballroom doors. But Beatrice was completely in the dark about the source of the funds. She still believed the fairy tale, and she was using this moment to assert her dominance over the gritty, unsavory sister who had been banished from the kingdom. I swiped down on my phone screen and silently activated the hidden call recording application my cybersecurity team had installed. I wanted a permanent record of everything this woman was about to say. "I am not finding it difficult at all," I replied calmly. "Monaco is beautiful this time of year. The distance provides excellent clarity." Beatrice let out another condescending laugh, the sound grating against the peaceful rhythm of the ocean waves. "It is so good of you to know your place and stay away." She sneered, her fake southern charm finally slipping to reveal the venom underneath. "We were all quite worried about how you would handle the exclusion, but I see you have accepted reality. You have to understand, Naomi Julian comes from a lineage of excellence. We represent the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society. We have a standard to uphold, a legacy to protect." I leaned back in my chair looking at the clear blue sky. A lineage of excellence. The sheer delusion required to utter those words was astounding. Her family's funeral home business had gone bankrupt 30 years ago. Her son was a generational grifter currently orchestrating a Ponzi scheme and dodging federal loan sharks. Yet here she was lecturing me about legacy from a hotel suite paid for by my stolen money. A standard I repeated softly, prompting her to continue. "Exactly," Beatrice said, emboldened by my quiet response. "Chloe is a beautiful girl, but your presence would have been an absolute distraction. We simply could not risk your blue-collar energy ruining the photographs. You operate in a world of corporate warfare scandals and public relations disasters. You carry the stench of desperation, Naomi. Julian's family is refined. We do not work in the mud. Having you standing next to us at the altar would have raised far too many uncomfortable questions among our guests." I watched a massive white superyacht slowly drift out of the harbor. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent building my firm, the sleepless nights, the relentless negotiations, the sheer willpower it took to become the most feared crisis manager in the Southeast. I had built a self-sustaining empire. Beatrice had built a house of cards on a foundation of unpaid credit bills. It takes a lot of mud to build a solid foundation, Beatrice, I said smoothly. But I suppose you would not know anything about that. Beatrice scoffed, clearly irritated that I was not breaking down in tears. There is no need to be defensive, dear. We all have our roles to play in this world. Some of us are meant to shine in the spotlight, to lead society and set the standard. And some of us are meant to stay in the background and do the heavy lifting. You should not feel ashamed of your blue-collar hustle. Keep working hard, dear. Someone has to foot the bill. The silence that followed was electric. Someone has to foot the bill. She had absolutely no idea how literal her words were. She had no idea that I was the only reason her son was not currently sitting in a federal holding cell. She thought she was insulting me, placing me in the role of the mindless worker bee, but she was actually validating exactly why I held all the power. I was the bank, I was the vault, and I had just locked the doors. I am certainly footing the bill, I replied, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I just hope Julian appreciates the investment. Oh, Julian appreciates everything. Beatrice rambled, her arrogance completely overriding her common sense. He is under a tremendous amount of stress, you know. High-level venture capitalism is not for the faint of heart. The demands on his capital are simply extraordinary right now. He has been working around the clock to secure the future for him and Chloe. I stayed entirely silent. In interrogations, silence is a vacuum that guilty or arrogant people desperately try to fill. Beatrice could not stand the dead air. She took another sip of her champagne, the clinking of the glass audible through the phone speaker. The alcohol and the inflated sense of superiority were loosening her tongue. It is actually quite a blessing that Vivian and Calvin stepped up the way they did. Beatrice continued, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. They understand the stakes. Julian has been dealing with some incredibly demanding business associates lately. You know how these massive international deals go. He needs to liquidate assets to satisfy aggressive investors before the honeymoon. It is all very complicated high finance maneuvering. But once this weekend is over, everything will be perfectly settled. My crisis manager brain locked onto that single glaring phrase. Liquidate assets to satisfy aggressive investors before the honeymoon. My eyes widened slightly behind my sunglasses. Beatrice thought she was bragging about her son's high-powered financial dealings. She thought she was throwing jargon around to sound important. But she had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle. Aggressive investors. Julian was not just in debt. He owed money to people who did not send strongly worded collection letters. He owed money to people who broke legs, or worse. That was why my parents had forged my signature. That was why they had stolen $500,000 from my estate. It was not just to fund a wedding. It was ransom money. Julian was desperate, and my parents had stolen my property to buy his safety. I tapped the screen of my phone, ensuring the recording app was capturing every single syllable. Aggressive investors. I repeated carefully, keeping my tone light and conversational. That sounds incredibly stressful for Julian. I hope these investors are willing to wait until after the cake is cut. Beatrice let out a dismissive scoff. Oh, they have been handled, dear. Vivian and Calvin made sure of it. As I said, we represent a lineage of excellence. We take care of our own. Julian will walk down that aisle completely unburdened, and Chloe will marry into the royalty she deserves. Now I really must go. The hotel manager needs to speak with me about the caviar station. Enjoy your little boat ride, Naomi. Do not work too hard. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. I ended the screen recording and saved the audio file to my secure encrypted drive. I sat perfectly still for a full minute, listening to the gentle crash of the waves against the side of the yacht. Beatrice had called to mock me. She had called to make me feel small, to remind me that I was a gritty blue-collar embarrassment who had been rightfully banished from their elite celebration. Instead, she had just given me a recorded confession that Julian was being hunted by dangerous creditors and that my parents had directly intervened to satisfy them using stolen funds. I opened my secure messaging app and navigated back to the Operation Legacy group chat with Vance, Sarah, and David. I uploaded the audio file of Beatrice's call. I typed a new directive. Review the audio file I just attached. Pay close attention to the 3-minute and 40-second mark. Beatrice mentions aggressive investors that Julian needs to satisfy before the honeymoon. Sarah cross-referenced the $200,000 offshore wire transfer we found earlier. Dig into that private equity firm in the Caymans. I want to know exactly who runs it. Find out what kind of business they actually do. David, look for any police reports, hospital admissions, or physical threats associated with Julian over the past 6 months. He is in bed with violent people. I need names, faces, and criminal records. I hit send. The luxury and peace of Monaco suddenly felt a million miles away. I was back in the war room. I was back in my element. My family had treated me like a disposable bank account, a gritty worker who was only good for footing the bill. They thought their pristine high society facade was bulletproof. They did not realize that I was the one holding the match, and Beatrice had just cheerfully poured gasoline over their entire legacy. I picked up my cold espresso and took a final sip. The countdown to Saturday had officially begun. I was going to let them put on their designer clothes. I was going to let them walk into that 5-star hotel ballroom. And then I was going to execute the most brutal, methodical takedown the Atlanta elite had ever witnessed. I watched the screen of my laptop blink as the encrypted files began downloading from Vance. It was barely dawn in Atlanta, but my team operated outside the constraints of standard time. They were nocturnal predators in the digital world, and they were the absolute best in the industry. I had asked them to tear Julian's life apart. I expected to find the usual high society garbage. Hidden mistresses, secret gambling debts, perhaps a few bounced checks to a luxury car dealership. The reality was a monster of an entirely different breed. Sarah's face appeared on my screen first, her expression completely devoid of its usual sharp humor. She looked genuinely disturbed. Naomi Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, serious register. Julian is not a venture capitalist. He is not a failed entrepreneur. He is running a highly sophisticated, completely illegal Ponzi scheme. I set my coffee cup down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the glass table. Explain. He is using his mother's church connections. Sarah continued, rapidly bringing up bank statements and wire logs on the shared screen. Beatrice has spent the last 30 years embedding herself in the administration of 3 different megachurches in the Atlanta area. She knows exactly who the wealthy elderly widows are. She knows who just lost a spouse, who just received a massive life insurance payout, and who is looking for a safe Christian investment to leave for their grandchildren. A sickening feeling began to coil in my stomach. Big Mama had been a devout woman, a pillar of her own church community. To know that Julian was preying on women exactly like my great-grandmother made the crime intimately vile. Go on, I commanded. Julian targets them. David added his audio feed, patching in. He uses his Kappa Alpha Psi pedigree, his tailored suits, and his mother's introductions to gain their absolute trust. He promises them guaranteed 20% returns through a phantom real estate development portfolio. But there is no real estate. There are no developments. He takes their retirement savings and uses the incoming cash from new victims to pay small monthly dividends to the older victims, keeping them docile. The rest of the money funds his midtown loft, his leased sports cars, and Chloe's entire bridal registry. I stared at the spreadsheets scrolling across my screen, row after row of wire transfers from joint checking accounts, retirement funds, and fixed income trusts. He was not just stealing, he was destroying the twilight years of vulnerable people who trusted him because he quoted scripture and wore the right fraternity pin. How much has he taken? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Dangerously. Right now, we are looking at roughly $7 million, Sarah replied. But the scheme is collapsing. He ran out of new investors 3 months ago. The dividend payments stopped. The elderly victims started asking questions. And that is when Julian made a fatal mistake. To keep the illusion alive and stop his victims from going to the authorities, he took out a high-interest short-term loan from an underground private equity group. The aggressive investors Beatrice had bragged about. Exactly, Vance said, his face replacing the spreadsheet on the screen. And Naomi, these are not just loan sharks. They are organized crime. They gave him $200,000 to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. When he could not pay the exorbitant interest, they threatened to bypass breaking his kneecaps and go straight to the feds with his accounting ledgers. They wanted their money back with a massive penalty, or they were going to hand him over on a silver platter. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. The ocean breeze outside felt completely irrelevant to the digital bloodbath unfolding on my monitor. The federal government, I said softly, the gears turning rapidly in my mind. Vance nodded. I ran a deep scrape on the SEC investigation dockets. Julian has been under a silent, sealed investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for 8 months. The FBI field office in Atlanta joined the probe 4 weeks ago. They are building a massive racketeering and wire fraud case. They have his bank records. They have the wire logs from the megachurch widows. The only thing they are waiting for is the final piece of the financial puzzle to tie Beatrice and the loan sharks into the federal indictment. The silence in the virtual room was absolute. My team had uncovered a financial crater so deep and so radioactive that anyone standing near it was guaranteed to be dragged into federal prison. And my parents just handed him $500,000, I whispered, the reality of Vivian and Calvin's unbelievable stupidity finally settling over me like a suffocating blanket. Sarah winced. Naomi, it is worse than that. By using Big Mama's estate as collateral for a fraudulent mortgage and then wiring that money directly into Julian's account to satisfy the loan sharks, your parents just commingled stolen funds with an active federally investigated Ponzi scheme. They did not just buy him a temporary lifeline. They made themselves accessories to money laundering and wire fraud. I closed my eyes. The sheer scale of their vanity was breathtaking. My mother and father had sat in their sprawling South Fulton estate, obsessed with country club memberships and front row seats at the megachurch. They had looked at Chloe, their golden child, and decided that maintaining the illusion of her flawless luxury was worth any price. They knew Julian was broke. They knew he was desperate. But they had no idea they were throwing themselves into the center of an FBI racketeering investigation. They risked federal prison, I said, my voice dead and cold, just to make sure Chloe got her dream wedding. They committed a felony to buy her a fake happily ever after. They did, David confirmed. And Beatrice is in just as deep. The $150,000 Julian transferred to her account yesterday. She has already started spending it. She wired $50,000 to the florist, $20,000 to the country club to clear her back dues, and $10,000 to a luxury travel agent for a post-wedding vacation to the Maldives. She is spending stolen money that is directly tied to a federal fraud investigation. The puzzle was complete. Every single one of them was standing on a trapdoor, perfectly unaware that the rope was already around their necks. My parents thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had secured their social standing by sacrificing my inheritance. Beatrice thought she had triumphed over the gritty blue-collar sister who did not fit their lineage of excellence. Chloe thought she was marrying a prince. Instead, they were all eagerly participating in a financial suicide pact. "Print it all!" I commanded, my eyes snapping open. Every ledger, every SEC docket number, every wire transfer receipt connecting the forged Cascade Heights mortgage to the megachurch victims and the loan sharks. I want physical copies bound in a single unredacted dossier. Vance raised an eyebrow. "Are you sending it to the FBI field office?" "Not yet," I replied, a slow, terrible smile spreading across my face. "If we hand it to the feds right now, they will freeze the accounts quietly and make the arrests in the middle of the night. That is far too merciful. My family wanted a spectacle. They wanted to show Atlanta high society exactly who they are. I am going to give them exactly what they asked for." Sarah let out a low whistle. "You are going to let the wedding happen." "I am going to let them put on their formal wear," I corrected. "I am going to let the pastors, the business associates, and the legacy families gather in that 5-star hotel ballroom." I am going to let Vivian and Calvin stand at the altar, beaming with stolen pride. And then I am going to deliver the truth. I instructed David to secure a private jet back to Atlanta. I told Sarah to prepare the dossier for physical delivery. I told Vance to set up a dead man's switch on the server, ensuring that the moment I gave the signal, the entire encrypted file would be blasted simultaneously to the Atlanta FBI field office, the SEC regional director, and the local news investigative desks. This was no longer just about recovering my stolen $500,000. This was about absolute surgical retaliation. In the crisis management industry, we have a fundamental rule. When an adversary tries to destroy your reputation, you do not just defend yourself. You strip them of the very thing they value most. For my parents, for Chloe and for Beatrice, the only thing that mattered was their social standing. They cared more about the perception of wealth than actual integrity. They worshipped at the altar of high society, and they had offered me as the sacrifice. I closed my laptop and stood up. The Monaco sun was high in the sky now, bathing the yacht in brilliant warm light. I walked over to my travel trunk and began to pack my tailored suits. I selected a charcoal gray ensemble, the exact outfit I wore when I walked into hostile corporate boardrooms to dismantle corrupt executives. My phone vibrated on the glass table. Another missed call from Chloe. Another frantic text from my mother begging me to turn the credit cards back on so the caterer would not cancel the reception dinner. They were suffocating under the pressure of their own lies, desperately trying to keep the illusion alive for just 4 more days. I ignored the phone. I did not need to scream. I did not need to argue. The evidence was irrefutable. Julian had stolen millions from the elderly. My parents had stolen $500,000 from me. They had tied their fates together in a neat criminal bow. I zipped my travel trunk closed. The peace of the Mediterranean had served its purpose. It had given me the clarity to see my family for what they truly were. They were not just social climbers. They were criminals who had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had banned me from the wedding because I did not fit their standard. I smiled at my reflection in the stateroom mirror. I was going to attend that wedding anyway, and I was bringing the federal government as my +1. The Gulfstream engines roared to life, a deep vibrating hum that echoed the relentless machinery of my own mind. As the jet taxied down the Monaco runway, I sank into the cream leather seat and opened my encrypted tablet for one final review of the dossier. We had the wire fraud. We had the money laundering. We had the forged notary stamps and the Ponzi scheme ledgers. It was a flawless, airtight package of absolute ruin. Then the screen flashed with a high-priority alert. It was David calling back into the secure channel. I tapped the screen to connect. "You have something else, David?" I asked, my voice calm over the sound of the accelerating jet. "You are going to want to sit down for this one, Naomi," David said, his tone lacking any of its usual professional detachment. Sarah and I were running a secondary sweep on Julian's legal footprint. We were looking for civil judgments, unpaid contractors, maybe a disgruntled former employee. We bypassed the financial courts and ran a deep scrape on the Fulton County family court dockets. "What did you find?" I demanded, my eyes narrowing. "Julian has 2 active paternity suits pending against him," David announced. The cases were filed under seal, but Vance managed to decrypt the filing headers. 2 different women, Naomi. Both of them are exactly 4 months pregnant. They filed the suits 3 weeks ago when Julian abruptly stopped paying their rent and cut off all communication. He ghosted them because the Ponzi scheme dried up and he ran out of hush money. I stared at the digital readout on my screen. The sheer, unadulterated slime of the man my sister was about to marry defied logic. Julian was not just a financial predator, draining the retirement accounts of elderly churchgoers. He was a serial manipulator living a triple life. He was actively stringing along 2 pregnant women while planning a lavish society wedding with my sister. He was desperate to marry Chloe because he thought my family had endless capital. David continued. He thought he was tapping into a bottomless well of generational wealth that could quietly pay off his loan sharks and fund his secret families indefinitely. He thought your parents were his ultimate bailout. A cold, bitter laugh escaped my lips. Julian thought he had found the perfect marks in Vivian and Calvin. He played right into their desperate need for validation. He gave them the illusion of legacy, and in exchange they literally stole $500,000 from their own flesh and blood to keep his sinking ship afloat. They were all using each other. It was a grotesque ecosystem of fraud, vanity, and deceit. Upload the family court dockets to the primary server, I instructed David. I want the names of those women, their contact information, and their legal representation. Add it to the final dossier. We are going to ensure the entire picture is painted with absolute clarity. Consider it done, David replied. Safe flight, boss. I closed the connection and leaned back as the jet lifted off, soaring over the brilliant blue Mediterranean. The financial crimes would guarantee Julian spent the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. The financial crimes would drag my parents into a brutal legal nightmare for their complicity. But the paternity suits, the secret pregnant mistresses. That was the psychological kill shot. That was the ace in the hole that would shatter Beatrice's arrogant claims of a lineage of excellence. It would destroy Chloe's meticulously curated social media aesthetic in a way that bank fraud never could. Society might forgive a white-collar crime, but they would devour a messy, humiliating scandal involving secret babies and double lives. I spent the 10-hour flight back to Atlanta meticulously reviewing the final execution strategy. I did not just want Julian arrested. I wanted the arrest to be a surgical strike. I wanted maximum exposure, maximum shock, and zero possibility of escape. To achieve that, I could not just drop an anonymous tip to a hotline. I needed a guaranteed immediate response from the absolute top of the federal food chain. Fortunately, in the world of elite crisis management, your client list is your greatest weapon. 3 years ago, the director of the FBI's Atlanta field office, a stern, highly decorated man named Thomas Sterling, found himself staring down the barrel of a catastrophic public relations disaster. A targeted cyber attack had compromised the personal data of several high-ranking agents, threatening to expose undercover operations and severely damage the Bureau's credibility. The federal government moves too slowly to manage real-time media fallout. Director Sterling needed an external ghost to sanitize the digital footprint, manage the press embargo, and rewrite the narrative before the press got wind of the breach. He called me. I neutralized the threat in 48 hours. The story never leaked. The agents remained safe, and Director Sterling kept his pristine reputation intact. He told me that day I had a favor in the bank, a favor with no expiration date. It was time to cash out. The moment my jet touched down at Peachtree DeKalb Airport, I bypassed my midtown penthouse entirely. I instructed my driver, David, to take me directly to a secure private meeting room I maintained in a high-rise office building downtown. It was a room specifically designed for sensitive client debriefings, completely soundproofed and swept daily for listening devices. I pulled out my encrypted mobile device and dialed Director Sterling's direct personal cell phone number. Naomi, his deep, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. To what do I owe the pleasure? It has been a long time, Director Sterling, I said, keeping my tone brisk and professional. I am cashing in my chip. I need 30 minutes of your time in person immediately. It concerns an active sealed investigation your office is currently running in conjunction with the Securities and Exchange Commission. There was a sharp pause on the line. The friendly demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by the guarded caution of a federal agent. I am listening, he said. I have the missing pieces to the Julian Vance investigation, I stated flatly. I have the wire transfer logs, the offshore Cayman accounts, the identities of the loan sharks he is currently dodging, and the exact ledger of the elderly victims he defrauded through the local megachurches. I also have indisputable proof of $500,000 in newly stolen funds that were just funneled into his accounts to cover his tracks. I could hear the sharp intake of breath over the phone. His office had been quietly chasing Julian for nearly a month, hitting dead ends and encrypted walls. I was holding the entire map. Where are you? Sterling asked, his voice deadpan. I gave him the address and the floor number. I will be here. Come alone. 40 minutes later, Director Sterling walked into my secure conference room. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He carried a leather briefcase and a look of intense curiosity. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I slid a thick-bound dossier across the polished mahogany table. The digital copies were already loaded onto a secure flash drive resting on top of the binder. "Everything you need is in there," I said, taking a seat opposite him. "The exact routing numbers for the offshore accounts. The identities of the private equity group in the Caymans, which I am sure you will recognize as an organized crime syndicate. You will also find the forged mortgage documents my parents created using their dealership's notary stamp to steal $500,000 from my personal estate. They wired that money directly to Julian to pay off the syndicate." Sterling opened the dossier. His eyes scanned the first few pages, his expression hardening as he absorbed the sheer magnitude of the evidence. "You just handed me a silver bullet, Naomi," he said, looking up at me. "We knew he was running a Ponzi scheme, but he covered his digital tracks well. We could not find the offshore links. How did you get this?" "I have a very motivated team," I replied smoothly. "And Julian made the fatal mistake of involving my assets in his survival plan." Sterling closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and caution. "You understand what this means for your parents, do you not? They are clearly implicated in federal wire fraud and money laundering. They facilitated the payoff to a known criminal syndicate." "I am fully aware of the consequences," I said, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "They made their choices. I am simply providing the receipts." Sterling nodded slowly. "I will have my agents secure the warrants immediately. We can freeze the accounts and have tactical teams at Julian's residence by tomorrow morning. We can end this quietly." "No," I said sharply. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "You owe me a favor, Director, and this is the specific condition of my cooperation. You do not arrest him tomorrow morning. You do not arrest him quietly." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "You want to dictate the terms of a federal raid?" "I want to dictate the timing," I corrected. "Julian and my sister are getting married this Saturday at the St. Regis Hotel in Buckhead. The reception begins exactly at 7 in the evening. The guest list includes every high-profile pastor, politician, and business leader my parents could con into attending. They want to celebrate their legacy of excellence. I want you to give them a memorable show." "You want us to raid a high-society wedding reception?" Sterling clarified, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He understood exactly what I was doing. "I want Julian handcuffed in front of the very people he planned to steal from next," I stated. "I want Beatrice to watch her son get hauled away for racketeering in front of her country club friends. I want my parents to stand in the middle of a $15,000 floral arrangement and explain to their megachurch pastors why the FBI is seizing their assets. You execute the warrants on Saturday night, Director. High noon in the ballroom. Maximum visibility." Sterling tapped his fingers against the dossier. "It is highly unorthodox, it is messy, it is perfectly legal, and it guarantees that all your primary targets will be in one room wearing tuxedos, completely unaware and unable to flee," I countered. "You get your grandstand arrest for the evening news, and I get my closure." The director stared at me for a long moment. He recognized the ruthless efficiency of the plan. He recognized the absolute chilling vengeance behind it. He picked up the flash drive and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Saturday at 7, Naomi," Sterling said, standing up from the table. "We will bring enough agents to secure the perimeter. I suggest you dress accordingly. It is going to be a bloodbath." He turned and walked out of the conference room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. I sat alone in the silence of the room. The trap was set. The execution was scheduled. My family had demanded I pay for a wedding I was not allowed to attend. I was about to give them a reception they would never, ever forget. My private jet had wheels up exactly 1 hour after Director Sterling walked out of my secure conference room. In the world of high-stakes crisis management, the golden rule of detonating an explosive is ensuring you are positioned safely outside the blast radius. I needed an ironclad alibi, a geographical fortress that proved I had absolutely zero involvement in the catastrophic events about to unfold. By Saturday afternoon, Atlanta time, I was sitting perfectly still on the sun-drenched balcony of my suite in Monaco. The Mediterranean Sea stretched out before me, an endless glittering expanse of brilliant sapphire. A gentle warm breeze carried the scent of sea salt and blooming citrus trees. I wore a white silk robe, my hair pulled back smoothly, a cold glass of sparkling water resting on the glass table next to my encrypted laptop. I was the absolute picture of serene, banished compliance. I had done exactly what Beatrice and my parents had demanded. I knew my place, and I had stayed away. 4,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, the St. Regis Hotel in Buckhead was vibrating with the frantic, manicured energy of a 500-guest society gala. I had hacked into the hotel's closed-circuit security feed using a digital backdoor my cybersecurity team had quietly propped open. The screen on my laptop was split into 4 high-definition camera angles, giving me a god's-eye view of the impending disaster. Camera 1 showed this grand lobby. I watched my mother Vivian floating through the opulent space in a custom emerald gown. She was greeting state senators, megachurch pastors, and legacy business tycoons with an air of absolute unearned triumph. My father, Calvin, stood near the entrance to the Astor Ballroom, sipping an expensive scotch and accepting congratulations from men whose approval he had spent his entire life chasing. Beatrice was holding court near the grand staircase, dripping in heavy pearls, throwing her head back to let out that syrupy, condescending laugh. Camera 3 showed the bridal suite. Chloe was surrounded by a chaotic swarm of makeup artists, hairstylists, and frantic bridesmaids. She wore a hand-beaded couture gown that easily cost $50,000. She was sipping champagne from a crystal flute, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire fairy tale aesthetic was being financed by stolen money and a violent criminal syndicate. They all looked so incredibly arrogant, so blissfully secure in their stolen elevation. I checked the gold Cartier watch on my wrist. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the evening in Atlanta. 1 hour before the string quartet would begin playing the processional march. 1 hour before Chloe was scheduled to walk down the aisle. It was time to pull the plug. I minimized the security feeds and opened my highly secure encrypted banking portal. I navigated directly to the master accounts tied to Operation Legacy. I pulled up the transaction history, instantly locating the fraudulent $500,000 transfer my parents had executed using Big Mama's estate as collateral. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I clicked the flag transaction icon. The banking system immediately prompted me for a reason. I selected criminal identity theft and unauthorized access. I uploaded the digital proof of the forged notary stamps, the falsified signature documents, and the IP tracking data my team had meticulously compiled. I hit submit. Banking algorithms operate with a ruthless, unfeeling efficiency that I deeply respect. The moment a transaction of that magnitude is flagged with verifiable, irrefutable proof of identity theft, the bank does not simply pause the transfer. They initiate a hard, immediate freeze on every single account associated with the offending parties to prevent further capital flight. I watched the status indicators on my dashboard turn from a healthy, active green to a harsh, flashing red. But I was not finished. My parents had been clever enough to establish a corporate slush fund to back the master tab at the St. Regis. They knew a 500-guest gala with open premium bars, caviar stations, and imported floral arrangements would run well over $250,000. They had linked a secondary corporate account to guarantee the hotel's staggering charges. I navigated to my crisis firm's overarching administrative controls. Since the corporate account was technically tethered to an LLC, where I still held primary executive oversight, I had the absolute legal power to sever the connection. I initiated a total administrative lock. I changed the security protocols, revoked my father's signatory access, and reported the account for highly suspicious activity. The trap was sprung. The vault was permanently sealed. Not a single cent could move in or out of Vivian Calvin or Chloe's names. They were completely, utterly insolvent. I leaned back in my plush lounge chair, feeling the warm Monaco sun on my face, and switched my screen back to the live security feeds. Camera 4 was positioned in the groom's holding room, just off the main ballroom. Julian stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting the bow tie of his bespoke velvet tuxedo. He looked handsome, polished, and entirely in control. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought the syndicate was paid off. The federal agents were clueless, and his access to my family's wealth was permanently secured. The heavy wooden door to the groom's suite swung open. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the room. It was Gerard, the director of events for the St. Regis. Gerard was a man who handled international royalty, Hollywood elite, and eccentric billionaires with equal poise. He carried a silver tablet and a very tight, practiced smile. Julian turned, flashing his signature, highly weaponized, charismatic grin. "Gerard, my man," Julian said smoothly, clapping his hands together. "Tell me the ballroom is ready. The guests are getting restless out there." "The ballroom is immaculate," Sir Gerard replied, his tone perfectly polite but entirely lacking in warmth. "However, we have a minor administrative issue that must be resolved before I can authorize my staff to open the doors for the reception. The final vendor fee for the catering, the premium open bar, and the staff overtime requires immediate authorization. It is a remaining balance of $100,000. Julian waved his hand dismissively, turning back to the mirror to check his cuffs. "Just run the primary corporate card on file. Calvin already authorized the overages." "I did run the primary card," Sir Gerard said, his voice dropping a full octave. "It was declined." I watched Julian's reflection in the mirror on my screen. The charismatic smile completely vanished. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving an ashen, sickly gray in its wake. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. "Declined," Julian repeated, his voice losing its confident swagger. "That is impossible. It is a corporate black card. Run it again." "I have run it 3 times," Sir Gerard stated, holding up the silver tablet. "The bank has placed a hard fraud lock on the account. I also attempted to run the secondary card provided by the bride earlier today. That card was also declined. In fact, every single piece of financial collateral your family provided has been frozen." Julian began to visibly sweat. I could see the sudden sheen of perspiration forming on his forehead under the bright vanity lights. The immaculate, untouchable grifter was suddenly confronted with a solid brick wall he could not charm his way over. He pulled a slim leather wallet from his tuxedo jacket and handed Gerard a platinum card of his own. "Try this one," Julian said, his breathing growing shallow. "It is my personal account." Gerard took the card, attached a mobile swiper to his tablet, and ran the magnetic strip. The tablet emitted a harsh, sharp beep that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Declined," Gerard said flatly, handing the card back. Julian's hands were actually shaking now. He was rapidly running out of options. The Ponzi scheme money was gone. The loan shark money was frozen. He had absolutely zero liquidity. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed Chloe's number. I immediately switched the audio feed to camera 3 in the bridal suite. Chloe picked up, giggling loudly with her bridesmaids in the background. "Julian, babe, you are not supposed to call me right now. It is bad luck to hear my voice before the ceremony." "Chloe?" Julian snapped, his voice tight, desperate, and entirely stripped of its usual affection. "I need you to give Gerard the numbers for your emergency credit cards, all of them, right now." "What are you talking about?" Chloe asked her, giggling, stopping instantly. "Dad already paid for everything." The bank flagged the primary account for fraud. Julian lied smoothly, his survival instincts kicking in to hide the massive, unfixable problem. "It is just a security hold because of the high vendor charges. Give Gerard your cards so they can open the ballroom doors. I will sort it out with the bank on Monday." Chloe huffed in deep annoyance, loudly complaining about the inconvenience as she rummaged through her designer clutch. She read off 3 different credit card numbers to Julian, who hastily relayed them to Gerard. I watched the screen intently as Gerard methodically typed each number into his tablet. Beep, declined, beep, declined, beep, declined. Gerard slowly lowered the tablet. He looked at Julian with the icy, unyielding detachment of a man who had zero tolerance for deadbeats attempting to defraud his prestigious hotel. "Sir, every single account is locked. I am currently holding over $250,000 in unpaid services. I have 50 waiters on the clock, A full culinary team and thousands of dollars in perishable seafood waiting in the kitchens. Give me an hour, Julian pleaded, his voice cracking the polished facade, shattering completely. I will get my mother to wire the funds. Just let the guests into the ballroom. Do not do this right now. I cannot do that, Sir Gerard said, his tone absolute steel. Hotel policy is very clear. If the master tab cannot be secured prior to the commencement of the reception, all services are immediately suspended. I need a valid authorized payment method for $100,000 right now, or I am instructing my staff to pull the catering, dismantle the bars, and lock the Astor ballroom doors. Julian began pacing the small holding room like a caged, panicked animal. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive product holding it in place. He muttered curses under his breath. He knew exactly what a frozen account meant. He knew the federal authorities had been circling him for months. In his frantic mind, he was likely assuming the feds had already moved in on his accounts. He was calculating his escape routes. He was looking at the door, weighing the very real option of abandoning Chloe at the altar and sprinting down the fire escape before the authorities arrived. Well, Sir Gerard pressed, standing perfectly still. Do you have an alternative payment method, or should I inform the catering director to pack up the caviar? Julian stopped pacing. He looked at Gerard with wild, desperate eyes. Let me speak to Calvin. My father-in-law will clear this up. He will write you a physical check. Get Calvin in here. I smiled at the screen, raising my glass of water in a silent toast to the groom. Yes, bring Calvin into the room. Let my father realize that the $500,000 he stole from me, the felony he so casually committed to secure his precious social standing, had been entirely neutralized with a single click of my mouse. Let the patriarch of the family experience the exact moment the floor fell out from under his legacy. The countdown had reached 0 and the detonation was flawless. I watched Gerard step out of the groom's suite, leaving Julian to his spiraling terror. The heavy wooden door clicked shut on my security feed, sealing him inside his own self-made purgatory. Beside my laptop, my phone began to vibrate against the glass patio table. It was a low, persistent buzz that signaled the beginning of the end. I picked up the device and watched the notifications stack up with frantic, rhythmic speed. The screen lit up, went dark, and immediately lit up again, a digital manifestation of absolute panic. My mother was the first to realize the severity of the situation. 5 missed calls from Vivian. She rarely called me once, let alone 5 times in rapid succession. She must have been standing right next to the catering director when the master tab bounced, her pristine social facade cracking under the weight of Gerard's icy hotel policies. Next came my father. 20 missed calls from Calvin. The man who had spent his entire life dictating orders, demanding immediate compliance, and treating me like a disposable corporate asset was suddenly reduced to mashing the redial button in a state of impotent rage. He was trapped in a luxury hotel with 0 financial leverage, and his patriarchal authority was entirely useless against a declined credit card machine. Then came the bride. 30 missed calls from Chloe. 60 missed calls in total, counting the stray attempts from Julian and Beatrice. 60 desperate attempts to reach the very person they had banished from their kingdom. They had mocked my blue-collar energy. They had declared me unfit for their refined high society photographs. Now they were suffocating under the debris of their own arrogance, frantically dialing the only person holding the oxygen tank. The red notification bubble over my voicemail icon indicated a completely full inbox. I unlocked the phone, swapped my empty water glass for a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and pressed play. I wanted to hear every single stage of their psychological collapse. The progression was a fascinating study in human desperation. It escalated rapidly from arrogant, entitled demands to frantic, sobbing pleas. The first message was from Vivian. Her tone clipped, breathless and irritated. Nia, call the bank immediately. There is some ridiculous security hold on the corporate cards and Gerard is being completely unreasonable. Handle this right now. We have guests arriving in 20 minutes. The second message was Calvin. The irritation had morphed into booming, authoritative panic. Nia, fix the cards right now. Family emergency. I do not care what time it is over there. You call your corporate banker and you authorize these charges. Call me back the second you get this. By the 10th voicemail, the entitlement had entirely evaporated. Chloe's audio feed was filled with the sound of hyperventilating and chaotic background shouting. Nia, please, you have to do something. The hotel is kicking us out. The florist is stripping the altar. They are literally taking the flowers out of the vases. Gerard told the catering staff to stop plating the food. Everyone is staring at us. Please pick up the phone. I set the device down on the table and let the remaining voicemails play on a continuous pathetic loop. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The dark, bitter roast grounded me as I looked out over the Mediterranean Sea. The water was painted with the vibrant, fiery colors of the setting sun, rippling gently under a cloudless sky. It was a scene of absolute, untouchable tranquility. It was a sharp, beautiful contrast to the brutal bloodbath unfolding on my laptop screen. I turned my attention back to the security feeds. The Astor Ballroom was descending into unparalleled historic chaos. The massive oak doors had been opened to the public, but not by choice. The 500 guests, the absolute elite of Atlanta high society, were beginning to filter into the room. They arrived dressed in their finest tailored tuxedos and glittering designer gowns, expecting a night of unbridled luxury and flawless execution. Instead, they were walking directly into a half-dismantled war zone. The florist's team, entirely unamused by the lack of payment, was actively tearing down the towering floral arches. I watched a man in a black polo shirt rip a massive bundle of white hydrangeas and imported cascading orchids from a crystal vase, tossing them unceremoniously into a plastic commercial trash bin. The sound of snapping stems and shattered floral foam echoed through the cavernous space. The catering staff, following Gerard's strict and unforgiving orders, were wheeling away the raw bar. The towering custom-carved ice sculpture, meant to hold thousands of dollars worth of beluga caviar, stood completely empty, melting sadly onto a black tablecloth. The premium liquor bottles had been boxed up and swiftly removed by the hotel's beverage directors, leaving only the basic complimentary water stations. Waiters in crisp white uniforms were actively pulling gold-rimmed charger plates off the tables, stacking them loudly onto metal utility carts right in front of the horrified attendees. The guests were completely paralyzed by the spectacle. The megachurch pastors, the venture capitalists, the legacy families, they were all wandering aimlessly around the stripped room. They were whispering behind their manicured hands, pointing at the bare tables, snapping discreet photos on their smartphones to send to the local gossip blogs. It was a public relations nightmare of epic generational proportions. The very people Vivian and Calvin had sacrificed my inheritance to impress were now the captive audience to their ultimate financial ruin. On camera, too, I spotted my parents. Vivian was backed into a corner near the empty bandstand, her face hidden behind a thick cardstock wedding program, her emerald gown shaking as she visibly trembled with mortification. She was trapped in the very spotlight she had craved her entire life. Calvin was engaged in a heated, red-faced argument with Gerard near the main entrance. He was gesturing wildly, pointing at his phone and running his hands over his balding head. Gerard remained completely stoic, his arms crossed neatly behind his back, shaking his head with lethal professionalism. No money, no service. It was the brutal reality of the corporate world crashing down on their fraudulent fairy tale. Julian was nowhere to be seen. He had likely locked himself inside the bathroom of the groom's suite, frantically trying to reach his offshore contacts or calling Beatrice for a lifeline that simply did not exist. He knew the syndicate was coming for him, and he knew his cover was entirely blown. Chloe was sitting on the edge of the elevated stage, her $50,000 couture gown pooling around her on the scuffed wooden floor. Her head was buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent sobs. The pristine, flawless aesthetic she had curated for months, the legacy she felt so entitled to, was entirely shattered. Her bridesmaids hovered nearby, looking deeply uncomfortable, entirely unsure of how to comfort a bride whose wedding was being physically repossessed. I checked my gold Cartier watch. I had let them marinate in this supreme humiliation for exactly 45 minutes. The guests were now awkwardly seating themselves at their assigned tables, staring silently at empty plates and bare centerpieces. The string quartet, having demanded their final payment up front, had packed up their cellos and violins and exited through the service elevator long ago. The room was filled only with the deafening, toxic sound of 500 people whispering about the Addams family's spectacular historic collapse. I picked up my phone. The screen was dark, having finally exhausted its barrage of notifications. I unlocked it and navigated to my contacts. I did not initiate a call. I simply waited. I knew Calvin's breaking point. I knew exactly how long it would take for his blinding rage to transition into absolute groveling desperation. He had exhausted his threats. He had exhausted his alternate credit cards. He was out of time, out of money, and out of pride. 3 minutes later, the screen illuminated with an incoming FaceTime request. The caller ID flashed Calvin's name. He was not calling to yell anymore. He was calling to beg. I took one final look at the Mediterranean horizon, drawing the profound, endless peace of the ocean deep into my lungs. I adjusted my silk robe, ensuring my posture was perfectly relaxed, perfectly indifferent. I was the master of this chessboard, and I was about to deliver the checkmate. I tapped the green button to accept the call. The screen flickered instantly, replacing the peaceful Mediterranean horizon with the chaotic, violently red face of my father. Calvin was completely unhinged. The camera shook wildly in his grasp. The ambient noise of the Astor ballroom was a deafening roar of confused guests and clattering silverware, but Calvin's screaming cut through it all. "Naomi!" He roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and deeply ingrained authority. "What the hell did you do to the corporate accounts? Gerard is threatening to call the police. Turn the cards back on right this second. This is a family emergency." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the porcelain cup clink softly against the saucer. The contrast between my absolute stillness and his frantic desperation was a physical weight on the line. "You have exactly 30 seconds to do exactly as I say, Calvin," I replied, my voice a blade of pure clinical ice. "Or I hang up this phone, block your number, and let the Atlanta Police Department escort you out of the St. Regis in handcuffs for theft of services." He stopped screaming. The sheer freezing drop in my tone paralyzed him. He was not speaking to his obedient daughter anymore. He was speaking to the crisis manager who dismantled empires for a living. "What do you want?" he demanded, his breath ragged, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. "There is an audio-visual control booth at the back of the Astor ballroom," I instructed, my eyes locked dead on his terrified face. "I know the hotel setup. I want you to walk over to the technician right now. You will hand him your phone. You will tell him to mirror this FaceTime call onto the main projection screens above the bandstand, and you will patch my audio directly into the ballroom's primary sound system." Calvin's eyes widened in sheer horror. "Are you insane? Half of Atlanta society is in this room, the pastors, the board members. I am not putting you on a 50-foot screen." I checked my watch. "You have 20 seconds. Calvin, 20 seconds before I hang up, and you explain to 500 elite guests why the catering staff is repossessing their dinner plates. 10, 9, 8. Wait, stop!" Calvin yelled, his pride finally snapping under the crushing weight of public humiliation. The camera perspective swung violently as he broke into a sprint across the ballroom floor. I watched the ceiling chandeliers streak past the lens. I heard him barking frantic orders at a deeply confused audiovisual technician. There was a flurry of muffled arguing, the sound of a cable clicking into a port, and a sudden sharp screech of microphone feedback. Then the visual feed stabilized. The transition was breathtaking. I was no longer looking at Calvin's sweaty face. The technician had mirrored my feed, and the camera now faced the entire Astor ballroom. I was looking out at a sea of 500 people. From my vantage point on the sun-drenched balcony in Monaco, my face was now looming 50 feet high over the most exclusive gathering in the city. The effect was instantaneous. The whispers, the clattering plates, the awkward murmurs of the bewildered elite abruptly ceased. The silence that fell over the massive, opulent room was absolute and suffocating. 500 faces turned upward, staring in total shock at the massive digital projection of the banished daughter. I scanned the crowd with clinical precision. I saw Vivian frozen near the doorway, her hand clamped over her mouth, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a tragic costume. I saw Beatrice sitting at the designated family table clutching her pearls, her smug aristocratic sneer replaced by a look of sheer terror. I saw Chloe standing near the head table, her $50,000 dress pooling around her mascara running down her cheeks. And finally, I saw Julian. He was hovering near the exit doors, looking exactly like a rat caught in a floodlight. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my glass desk. I did not yell. I did not need to. The amplified audio system carried my perfectly leveled, calm voice into every corner of the room. "Welcome to the wedding," I said, the sound echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "My apologies for the delay. I know many of you are wondering why the floral arrangements are currently being thrown into commercial trash bins and why the caviar stations are empty. I am here to provide some clarity." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw several high-profile pastors exchanging nervous glances. I saw legacy venture capitalists shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "My parents, Calvin and Vivian, invited you all here tonight to celebrate their standard of excellence." I continued, my voice smooth and relentless. "They wanted to showcase their wealth, their legacy, and their pristine standing in Atlanta society. Unfortunately, the entire spectacle you are sitting in right now is a federally investigated crime scene." The silence morphed into a palpable electric shockwave. Vivian let out a strangled sob. Calvin buried his face in his hands. I reached off screen and pulled the thick, unredacted dossier into the camera's view. I held up the first document, bringing it close to the lens so the high-definition projector would display every printed word to the crowd. "The reason the hotel's master tab has been declined is because I personally froze the accounts an hour ago," I stated, staring directly at my parents through the camera. "The $500,000 used to secure this ballroom purchase, that dress, and fund this charade was stolen. Calvin and Vivian forged notary stamps to place a fraudulent mortgage on my personal estate. They committed felony wire fraud to buy a fake happily ever after. And they did it to satisfy a violent underground private equity syndicate that was hunting their future son-in-law." I let the words hang in the air. The absolute horror on the faces of the guests was a masterpiece of social destruction. People were physically backing away from the head table. "But that is only the beginning of the financial rot," I said, shifting my gaze directly to the table where Beatrice sat paralyzed. I flipped the dossier to the next section. I held up the meticulously highlighted bank ledgers and offshore wire transfers. "I know there are several prominent members of Beatrice's church congregation in attendance tonight. I suggest you pay very close attention." I watched as dozens of elderly men and women in the crowd sat up straighter, their expressions shifting from shock to sudden sharp fear. "Julian is not a venture capitalist," I announced, dropping the heavy hammer of truth right onto the center of the ballroom floor. "He is the architect of a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. For the past 3 years, he has used his mother's church connections to target elderly widows, draining their retirement savings, joint checking accounts, and fixed income trusts. He promised you guaranteed real estate returns. There is no real estate. There are no developments. He took your life savings and used it to fund his midtown loft, his sports cars, and the very champagne you were supposed to drink tonight." Chaos erupted in the ballroom. An older woman near the front row shrieked, clutching her chest. 2 men in tailored suits jumped to their feet, shouting furiously in Julian's direction. Beatrice desperately tried to stand up, but her legs gave out, sending her crashing back into her chair. "The FBI's Atlanta field office and the Securities and Exchange Commission have been running a silent investigation for 8 months. I continued, speaking over the rising tide of outrage. "They now have the offshore routing numbers, the wire logs, and the complete list of victims. Federal tactical teams will be executing search warrants on Julian's accounts, Beatrice's assets, and my parents' estate. Every single dollar in this room is radioactive." Julian was backing toward the service doors, his face a mask of absolute panic. Guests were actively shouting now. The beautiful, pristine gala had completely disintegrated into a mob of defrauded, furious elites. "I am not finished," I commanded. My voice cracked like a whip through the speakers, silencing the room one final time. I had saved the most brutal, deeply personal ammunition for the end. I flipped the dossier to the final page. I held up the 2 Fulton County family court dockets, making sure the official seals were clearly visible on the massive projection screens. I looked directly at my sister. Chloe was gripping the edge of the head table, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical heaves. "Chloe, my parents barred me from this wedding because they claimed my blue-collar energy would ruin the photographs," I said, my tone dripping with lethal pity. "They claimed Julian came from a refined lineage and that I would be an embarrassment to your new, perfect life." I tapped the court dockets against the glass table. "Julian has 2 active paternity suits pending against him in Fulton County," I revealed, letting the final fatal bomb detonate. "The suits were filed 3 weeks ago. Both women are exactly 4 months pregnant. He ghosted them when he ran out of the hush money he stole from your wedding guests. He planned to use our family's capital to fund his secret double lives indefinitely." Chloe let out a sound that I could only describe as a dying animal. She collapsed onto the floor, her $50,000 gown tangling around her legs, sobbing uncontrollably into the polished wood. Vivian rushed to her side, falling to her knees, completely abandoning her emerald elegance to wail alongside her daughter. I looked at Julian. He was completely trapped. Several groomsmen men who had likely invested in his fraudulent funds had physically blocked the exit doors. There was no escape. The federal authorities were coming for his freedom, but I had already stripped him of his humanity. I leaned back in my chair, the warm Mediterranean sun washing over my white silk robe. I looked out over the ballroom of ruined lives, shattered reputations, and absolute generational disgrace. They had tried to banish me to protect their perfect facade. I had burned the entire theater to the ground. "Julian," I said softly, my voice carrying a final chilling note of finality through the speakers. "I believe your other 2 pregnant fiancés are waiting outside with the federal agents." I looked down at the sobbing broken heap of tulle and lace on the ballroom floor. "Chloe, enjoy your legacy." I reached forward and ended the call. The screen went instantly black. The connection was severed. The war was over. I picked up my coffee, turned to face the endless blue ocean, and finally smiled. I kept the secondary security feeds running. I had severed the direct audio-visual link, plunging the massive projector screens back into darkness, but I was not about to miss the physical climax of my carefully orchestrated demolition. Through the silent, high-definition lenses of the hotel cameras, I watched the immediate aftermath of my broadcast. For a fraction of a second, the Astor Ballroom was a frozen tableau. 500 of Atlanta's most influential figures stood paralyzed, their collective gaze shifting from the blank screens to the head table. The shock was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the room. Then the heavy oak doors at the rear of the ballroom burst open with explosive force. It was not the catering staff returning with the seized appetizers. It was a perfectly synchronized flood of federal agents. Over 24 men and women wearing tactical gear, dark windbreakers with prominent FBI lettering across their backs, and stern, uncompromising expressions poured into the opulent space. Director Thomas Sterling led the vanguard, moving with the ruthless efficiency of a predator locking onto its prey. The visual contrast was striking. The federal agents, clad in dark utilitarian armor, cut a sharp, violent path through the sea of pastel chiffon, designer silk, and tailored velvet. Guests scrambled out of the way, knocking over gold Chiavari chairs and shattering crystal goblets in their desperate haste to distance themselves from the blast zone. The sheer panic in the room was a beautiful, chaotic ballet. Sterling raised his hand, gesturing sharply toward the groom's suite and the head table. His agents split into precise tactical formations. Half the squad moved swiftly toward my parents, while the other half converged directly on the man of the hour. Julian had finally realized that the groomsmen blocking the service doors were not going to let him pass. The men he had recruited to stand by his side at the altar were the same men whose trust funds he had quietly drained. They crossed their arms and physically shoved him back toward the center of the room, just as the federal agents closed the perimeter. Julian's polished, charismatic facade completely dissolved into raw, animalistic terror. He threw up his hands, taking frantic steps backward, his expensive velvet tuxedo jacket bunching awkwardly around his shoulders. I watched on the feed as two burly federal agents grabbed his arms, spinning him around with brutal force. They slammed him face first against the nearest linen-draped table. The impact sent a towering, unpaid centerpiece crashing to the floor. The agents patted him down, barking unheard commands before wrenching his arms behind his back. The distinct metallic glint of steel handcuffs caught the light of the chandeliers as they locked tightly around his wrists, completely ruining the line of his custom cuffs. The golden boy of Buckhead society, the charming venture capitalist who had promised generational wealth, was now just another common criminal being hauled away in front of his fraternity brothers and the very elite he had scammed. Near the family tables, Beatrice realized the absolute finality of the situation. Her son was in handcuffs. Her offshore accounts were frozen. The facade she had fiercely defended was reduced to ash. True to her dramatic nature, she attempted one final desperate play for sympathy. She pressed the back of her manicured hand to her forehead, let out a silent theatrical gasp, and threw her weight backward, expecting one of her loyal country club friends or fellow church members to rush forward and catch her falling form. She expected a flurry of concern, a rush of smelling salts, a protective circle of high society peers shielding her from the indignity of the raid. She received absolutely nothing. The women she had sipped tea with for decades simply took a collective step backward. They pulled their expensive gowns out of the way, their faces twisted in absolute disgust and repulsion. Beatrice plummeted backward, her arms flailing wildly as she realized no safety net was coming. She hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud, her pearl necklace snapping and sending tiny white spheres bouncing across the ballroom. She lay there completely ignored, a discarded relic of a fraudulent dynasty. The camera panned to the head table, capturing the total disintegration of my sister. Chloe was still on the floor, but the sorrow had morphed into a manic, unhinged hysteria. She was screaming, her mouth wide, her face blotchy and red. She grabbed handfuls of the $50,000 couture gown, the dress that was supposed to cement her status as a flawless bride, and began ripping at the delicate tulle. The dress was unpaid. The wedding was unpaid. Her entire identity was built on a foundation of stolen capital, and the realization was driving her out of her mind. She shrieked at the federal agents. She shrieked at the retreating guests. She shrieked at the empty air. Her bridesmaids, the women she had carefully selected for their social standing and aesthetic appeal, abandoned her completely. They gathered their purses and quietly joined the mass exodus, leaving the bride alone in a pile of ruined fabric and shattered vanity. While Chloe descended into madness and Beatrice played dead on the floor, Director Sterling personally approached Vivian and Calvin. My parents had backed themselves against the wall, their expressions a mixture of arrogant indignation and rising terror. Calvin puffed out his chest, attempting to use his commanding patriarchal posture to intimidate the federal director. I could see him pointing his finger, likely demanding a phone call to his lawyers, insisting this was a massive misunderstanding. Sterling simply shook his head, completely unmoved by the bluster of a disgraced car dealership owner. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, a federal warrant bearing a judge's signature. He thrust the paper into Calvin's chest. On the screen, I watched Sterling signal two additional agents. They stepped forward, flanking my parents. Vivian tried to pull away, her face contorting with humiliation as an agent firmly grasped her arm. They were not being placed in handcuffs yet, but the visual was equally damning. They were being publicly escorted out of the St. Regis, flanked by federal law enforcement for immediate questioning regarding felony wire fraud, money laundering, and the forgery of official notary stamps. As the agents marched Calvin and Vivian across the massive ballroom, the final, most devastating consequence of my plan unfolded. The elite social circles of Atlanta operate on a strict, unspoken code of ruthless self-preservation. They will overlook cruelty, they will ignore arrogance, and they will tolerate bad behavior provided the money remains clean and the reputation remains intact. But the moment the FBI raids a gala, the moment a family is outed as common thieves stealing from their own blood to pay off organized crime syndicates, the excommunication is instantaneous and absolute. As my parents were led past the 500 guests, They had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress. They were met with a wall of cold, unyielding backs. The state senators turned away, pretending to examine the architecture of the ceiling. The business tycoons pulled out their phones, actively deleting Calvin's contact information while he walked past them. The megachurch pastor's men who had gladly accepted Vivian's lavish tithes looked at her with righteous condemnation, physically shielding their wives from her presence. No one offered a word of support. No one promised to call their lawyers. No one even made eye contact. Vivian and Calvin were ghosts suddenly invisible to the very society they had worshipped. They were being erased from the hierarchy in real time. The silence of the crowd as they were marched out the double doors was the loudest, most crushing condemnation they could ever receive. I watched Julian being shoved through the service exit, his head forced down by the agents, his custom velvet suit stained with the debris of the ruined centerpieces. I watched paramedics finally arrive to check on the still screaming Chloe, wrapping a foil emergency blanket around her shoulders as she sat alone amidst the wreckage of her stolen fairy tale. I watched Beatrice slowly pick herself up off the floor, realizing no one was coming to her rescue, dusting off her skirt and limping toward the lobby in total disgrace. The ballroom slowly emptied, leaving behind only scattered rose petals, abandoned champagne flutes, and the absolute ruin of the Vance and Adams families. I reached out and gently closed my laptop, the screen snapping shut with a satisfying click. The silence of my Monaco balcony washed over me, replacing the manic visual noise of the Buckhead Gala. The air felt incredibly clean, untainted by the toxic vanity and desperate fraud that had choked my family for decades. I stood up, adjusting the belt of my silk robe, and walked to the edge of the balcony. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, painting the Mediterranean sky in brilliant shades of indigo and violet. A profound, unshakable calm settled deep into my bones. I had not just survived the predators in my own bloodline. I had surgically dismantled them, exposing their rot to the light of day and ensuring they could never ever use my name, my capital, or my legacy to build their fraudulent empires again. They had demanded I pay for a wedding to celebrate their excellence. I had delivered exactly what they deserved: a masterclass in accountability, executed with absolute terrifying perfection. The slate was entirely clean. The slate was completely mine. I picked up my coffee cup, turned my back on the West, and walked back inside to begin the rest of my life. 6 months is an eternity when you are falling from a very great height. In the relentless, unforgiving world of federal indictments and high society excommunications, half a year is more than enough time to completely erase a legacy. Julian Vance did not go down fighting in a blaze of courtroom glory. He folded the second director Sterling, presented him with the offshore routing data, and my perfectly compiled ledger of his victims. He took a blind plea deal to avoid a public trial that would have exposed the grotesque, humiliating details of his double life to an even wider audience. The federal judge, entirely unmoved by Julian's weaponized charm and crocodile tears, handed down a 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary in Central Florida. There were no bespoke velvet tuxedos or expensive hair products in his new wardrobe, only stiff, faded khaki uniforms and slip-on shoes. The golden boy of Buckhead society was assigned to cafeteria duty, spending his days scrubbing industrial food trays for men he would have previously crossed the street to avoid. His offshore accounts were seized, drained to the absolute bottom to pay restitution to the elderly church members he had systematically defrauded. The paternity suits moved forward without his presence, resulting in default civil judgments that stripped away whatever meager hidden assets the federal government had somehow overlooked. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered about at country club bars, entirely stripped of his power, his freedom, and his name. For my parents, the destruction was far more agonizing because they had to live through it in public. The federal investigators were merciless in their pursuit of the stolen funds. The forged notary stamps and the fraudulent mortgage execution triggered a massive, unavoidable wave of legal consequences. To cover the astronomical federal fines and their mounting criminal defense fees, Calvin and Vivian were forced into total, devastating liquidation. The car dealership, the supposed crown jewel of Calvin Adams's life, was auctioned off piece by piece. I read the financial reports from my office in Monaco. I saw the digital photos of the repo men towing away the luxury inventory. The giant, arrogant signs bearing Calvin's name were unceremoniously ripped down, replaced by the sterile banners of a corporate auto group that bought the lot for pennies on the dollar. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of their punishment. The social death was what truly broke them. The elite circles of Atlanta act like a ruthless immune system, swiftly expelling any infected cells to protect the host. The board of their prestigious country club did not even wait for a criminal conviction. They convened an emergency meeting the Monday following the disastrous wedding raid. A courier was dispatched to my parents' home to physically retrieve their membership cards, along with a formal, legally binding letter of expulsion. Vivian had attempted to attend a charity luncheon later that week, desperately trying to maintain her facade of unbothered elegance. She was stopped at the door by private security and quietly asked to leave the premises. The pastors who had happily consumed their donations suddenly denounced them from the pulpit, using my parents as a sermon illustration on the evils of vanity and greed. Then came the eviction. With their accounts frozen and the business liquidated, they defaulted on the mortgage of their sprawling suburban mansion. The bank moved with astonishing speed. The same federal agents who had raided the wedding returned to oversee the seizure of the property. Vivian and Calvin were forced to pack whatever cheap, non-essential possessions they were legally allowed to keep into cardboard boxes while the neighborhood watched from their manicured lawns. They relocated to a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a zip code they had spent their entire lives mocking. There was no more catering, no more galas, no more legacy. The peeling linoleum floors and the constant noise of their neighbors replaced the quiet luxury of their former life. They spent their days trapped in a tiny living room, bitterly blaming each other for a downfall they had entirely orchestrated themselves. Chloe's meticulously curated aesthetic completely disintegrated. The viral videos of her screaming on the ballroom floor, tearing at an unpaid $50,000 couture gown, became internet legend. Her social media sponsors dropped her, instantly issuing public statements, distancing their brands from the fraud scandal. The boutique fitness studios revoked her memberships. Her sorority sisters blocked her number. Without Julian's stolen money, and without my parents' financial backing, Chloe was forced to face the brutal reality of the working class. She had to sell her designer bags, her shoes, and her jewelry, just to pay off the retainers for her bankruptcy lawyers. She was currently working as a shift supervisor at a mid-tier retail store in a dying mall, forced to wear a stiff polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She spent her shifts hiding in the stockroom, utterly terrified of running into the women she used to rule over, terrified they would recognize her from the viral video. Her fairy tale had ended, and the reality she woke up to was a nightmare of her own making. While their world burned to ash, mine expanded. My crisis management firm had experienced an unprecedented surge in revenue. My handling of the St. Regis incident, though extreme, had cemented my reputation in the deepest, most secure circles of international business. Clients knew that if I could dismantle my own bloodline with that level of surgical precision, there was absolutely nothing I could not do to protect their empires. I was no longer just a fixer operating in the shadows. I was an apex predator in the corporate ecosystem, managing billionaires, tech moguls, and sovereign wealth funds. Which is exactly why I had returned to Atlanta. The private jet touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport on a crisp, clear Tuesday morning. I did not sneak back into the city. I did not hide behind tinted windows or travel under an assumed name. I stepped off the plane wearing a sharp charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, carrying a leather briefcase that held the finalized deeds to my newest acquisition. David, my trusted driver and head of personal security, was waiting on the tarmac beside a sleek black sedan. "Welcome back to Atlanta, boss," David said, offering a rare, genuine smile as he opened the heavy car door. "It is good to be back, David. I replied, sliding into the cool leather seat. Take me to the new property. Let us see what we bought. We glided onto the interstate, cutting through the morning traffic toward the heart of the city. I looked out the window, watching the familiar skyline rise against the bright blue sky. I felt absolutely no nostalgia. I felt no lingering trauma or regret. The city was just a grid of opportunities, a landscape of steel and glass, where I dictated the terms of engagement. The ghosts of my family's expectations had been entirely exorcised. The sedan pulled up to the curb in the very center of Midtown. I stepped out onto the pavement and looked up. Towering above me was 30 stories of sheer, flawless glass and dark steel. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a monument to corporate power and absolute control. It was the premier commercial real estate property in the district, a building that commanded respect just by its sheer physical presence. I owned it, every single square foot. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the massive, expansive lobby. The floors were cut from pristine white marble that gleamed under the recessed lighting. The walls were paneled in rich dark walnut, accented with brushed brass. The air smelled of expensive espresso and crisp, sanitized ambition. Security guards in tailored black suits stood at attention near the gleaming elevator banks, their eyes scanning the room with sharp vigilance. I approached the polished granite security desk. The chief of security, a man named Marcus, whom I had personally vetted and hired weeks ago, stood up immediately. "Good morning, Ms. Vance," Marcus said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet space. "The executive elevator has been keyed to your biometrics. The contractors finished the top 3 floors last night. Your new headquarters are entirely operational and secure." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, handing him my identification card to log into the master system. "Ensure the transition team has the final access codes by noon." I turned away from the desk and walked toward the center of the lobby. Mounted on the dark walnut wall was the Master Building Directory, a massive digital screen displaying the elite corporate tenants occupying the lower 27 floors. There were law firms, international banks, and global consulting groups. But at the very top, glowing in stark, unyielding white letters, was the name of my firm. We occupied the penthouse levels. We owned the air they breathed. I stood there perfectly still, looking at my name etched into the digital stone of the city. 6 months ago, I had been banished from my own family, told I lacked the refinement and the legacy to stand beside them. They had tried to push me into the shadows so they could shine in the stolen light. They had demanded I pay for a fairy tale I was not allowed to attend. Now they were huddled in a dark, cramped apartment hiding from the world, while I literally owned the skyline. I did not achieve this by playing their games. I did not achieve this by shrinking myself to fit their fragile egos or funding their delusions of grandeur. I achieved it by recognizing my own power and refusing to let anyone, not even my own blood, compromise my foundation. I had burned their fraudulent kingdom to the ground, and from those ashes I had built an empire of glass, steel, and absolute truth. The elevator chimed a soft, pleasant sound that echoed through the marble lobby. The polished steel doors slid open, waiting to carry me to the top floor. I adjusted the lapels of my suit, shifted the weight of my briefcase, and walked forward. I stepped into the elevator, turned around, and watched the lobby doors slide shut, sealing me inside. The ascent was smooth, silent, and incredibly fast. I was exactly where I belonged. I was at the very top. My morning was a masterclass in high-level execution. I sat in my corner office entirely encased in floor-to-ceiling glass, finalizing a merger that would redefine the southeastern corporate landscape. Around noon, I decided to head downstairs to personally review the final security protocols with Marcus. I stepped into my private elevator, the descent as flawless and rapid as my ascent had been. The polished steel doors slid open to the expansive sunlit lobby. I walked toward the main security desk, my heels clicking sharply against the white marble. Marcus was reviewing a digital manifest, but his attention suddenly snapped toward the revolving glass doors at the front entrance. His posture instantly stiffened. I followed his gaze. 3 figures were shuffling through the heavy glass doors, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of my immaculate corporate fortress. It took me a full 3 seconds to recognize them. Vivian, Calvin, and Chloe. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant, untouchable elite of Atlanta society had been entirely erased. Vivian was not wearing custom emerald silk. She wore a faded, shapeless beige cardigan over wrinkled slacks. Her perfectly colored hair was limp, showing harsh gray roots, and her posture, once rigidly aristocratic, was completely slumped. Calvin looked 10 years older. The booming, tyrannical patriarch was gone, replaced by a frail, trembling old man in a cheap, ill-fitting polo shirt and scuffed loafers. And Chloe, my sister, who had once demanded a $50,000 gown and scoffed at anything less than perfection, was practically unrecognizable. She wore a pair of faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Her face was devoid of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and sunken with permanent exhaustion. The entitlement had been drained right out of her soul. They huddled together near the entrance, looking around the massive, intimidating lobby with wide, terrified eyes. They looked like refugees. In a way, they were. They were exiles from a kingdom they had destroyed with their own hands. Marcus immediately stepped out from behind the granite desk, his hand resting near his radio. "Mom," he said, his voice low and professional. "Should I have security escort them off the premises?" "No," I replied softly, my eyes fixed on the pathetic trio. "Let them approach." Calvin spotted me first. He let out a ragged gasp, nudging Vivian and pointing a shaking finger in my direction. They shuffled across the gleaming marble floor, their cheap shoes squeaking awkwardly in the quiet, hushed atmosphere of the lobby. They stopped 5 feet away from me. The physical distance felt like an insurmountable chasm. Nia, Calvin rasped, his voice weak and completely broken. "We saw the news. We saw that you acquired this building. We had to scrape together our last few dollars just to buy bus tickets to get down here." I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I offered absolutely no greeting, no warmth, no opening. I simply watched them squirm under the weight of my silence. Vivian stepped forward, tears instantly brimming in her eyes. The tears were real this time. There was no theatrical performance, no society gala audience to impress. This was raw, unadulterated desperation. "Nia, please," Vivian sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand, but stopping short of touching me. "You have to help us. The apartment they moved us into is a nightmare. The landlord is threatening eviction because your father cannot find work. My medical bills are piling up. Chloe cannot make enough at the mall to even cover groceries. We are starving, Nia. We have absolutely nothing left." Chloe looked down at her scuffed shoes, a single tear cutting a track down her pale cheek. "Nia, we are so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We were wrong. We lost everything. Julian ruined our lives." I tilted my head, studying them with the clinical detachment of a scientist, observing a failed experiment under a microscope. "Julian did not ruin your lives," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the massive lobby. "You ruined your own lives. Julian simply provided the match. You gladly poured the gasoline." Calvin dropped to his knees. The sight of my father, the man who had demanded total obedience and treated me as a disposable asset, kneeling on the cold marble floor of my building, was a profound, striking image. "Nia, we're blood!" Calvin cried out, his voice cracking with panic. He clasped his hands together in a pathetic gesture of begging. "We have nowhere to go. Please, you have so much. Just give us a place to stay. Just give us a small loan to get back on our feet. We will do anything. We will pay you back. You cannot just leave us on the street." I looked down at the man on the floor. I looked at the mother who had gladly sacrificed my future for her vanity. I looked at the sister who had mocked my very existence. They were banking on a concept of family they had never actually honored. They believed that blood was a magical currency that could buy them forgiveness after they had bankrupted my trust. I looked at them with absolute ice. "There wasn't enough space for me at your elite wedding, remember," I said. My words were not shouted. They were delivered with a quiet, lethal precision that cut straight through to their bones. Now there isn't enough space for you in my life. Vivian let out a strangled, agonizing wail. Calvin's shoulders shook as he wept openly on the floor. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the finality of my judgment. I turned slightly and signaled to Marcus. He immediately reached behind the heavy granite security desk. He pulled out a crisp white piece of paper attached to a standard clipboard. I took the clipboard, stepped forward, and slid the piece of paper across the marble security desk. Calvin slowly raised his tear-streaked face, looking at the document with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. He reached up with a trembling hand and pulled it closer. It was not a check. It was not a lease agreement for a luxury apartment. It is an application for the night shift janitorial crew at this building. I explained, my tone entirely flat and businesslike. Minimum wage. If you need money, fill it out. Otherwise, call an Uber. I'm busy. I did not wait for their response. I did not need to witness their final realization that the game was permanently over. I turned on my heel, the sharp sound of my shoes echoing across the marble floor. I walked directly toward my private elevator, leaving Marcus to supervise their exit. The polished steel doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside and turned around. Through the narrowing gap of the closing doors, I saw them one last time. 3 broken, impoverished figures standing in the center of my immaculate, towering empire, staring at a janitorial application like it was their last lifeline. They were frozen in the silent, cold lobby, entirely insignificant against the massive scale of the world I had built. The doors close, fade to black, fade to